Chapter 22, Section 3, United States History Drawn into the War. So what war are we talking about? We're going to be talking about World War I. And we're going to go over what drew us into the war. In fact, the war had been going on for like 2.5 years before the United States even got involved. And it was actually at its low point in Europe. So we're going to talk about neutrality, when the United States was neutral, onto sympathy toward the Allies, submarine warfare at this time, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Sussex Pledge, the Zimmerman Note, and on to the declaration of war. So you remember these things, and basically these things right here that I went over will be very instrumental in drawing the United States into World War I. Here's some pictures of the Zimmerman telegram. You can see has to do with Mexico here. The Great War, the sinking of the Lusitania, on to remember Belgium. We'll see what happened in Belgium to draw us into the war. The United States neutrality. So President Wilson issued the Declaration of Neutrality, the United States being neutral and not getting involved. And he asked Americans to remain impartial in thought as well as action. And both the Allies and the Central Powers gave a widespread propaganda in the United States, an effort for the United States sympathy. So we were getting all kinds of propaganda, both from the Germany and the Central Powers and from the Allies. At this time, the neutrality here, you can see President Wilson, basically two groups dominated American public opinion: the isolationists, America to stay out of the war, and the interventionists, America should enter the war. In August 1914, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson urged Congress to officially declare neutrality, right? To be neutral. And the United States must be neutral, in fact, and that was his motto. In fact, even during his campaign for his second term, he basically said, God bless Wilson. He keeps us out of war in Europe. So peace in America, those kind of things. Here, vote for Wilson, who kept us out of the war. And the strict neutrality that he had said and stood on it during this time. Well, let's find out what makes him change his mind. The sympathy towards the Allies, of course, because a lot of Americans wanted to support the Allies, and it grew stronger. They held respect for the British law and culture, and things that were going on they were very sympathetic to the British. Historical gratitude to France, and France and Britain both were allies. As for France, had actually helped us in our wars, and especially our war for independence. And the Allied victory would help spread political freedom in the world. So basically knowing that the Allies were standing actually up for freedom. The tyranny of the German government over the people of Western Europe was against American ideals. So basically Germany was kicking up its boots actually and deciding to invade lands that were at peace. And so the Americans looked at this as, what is going on? And Americans were appalled by the reports of these German atrocities that they were giving over conquered people, especially in Belgium. As they invaded Belgium, here's one of their big balloons here. Picture of their balloons. They had these that they were like huge balloons in the sky that would come down with certain bombs during this time. Remember Belgium. We had here, united we stand, help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. Here's the head of the Kaiser of Germany. Now, so Americans were appalled by how they were treating the peoples that they conquered. And they were hearing stories about that. Economic considerations, too, because America traded with both the Allies and the Central Powers, But most of the trade was with the Allies, with England and France. And the United States continued to increase commercial trade with the Allies even when they were at war between 1914 and 1916. And exports actually quadrupled with the Allies, not the Central Powers. So much of what the Allies were purchasing was on credit, and the United States was actually allowing them to have credit and allowing them to borrow from America. And so the Allies needed to win to pay back their debts. If England and France lost, they would be in great debt, and so would America. So that's an economic consideration, of course. The German agents, in order to stop the flow of goods and munitions to Allied nations, plotted bombings, fires, and other acts of sabotage in American factories. So there were some bombing going on. Here's the Black Tom explosion in New York that happened. So here in the midst of all this, our factories are being sabotaged by German agents. That would make a difference as Americans saw, what are they doing? They're already blowing up our factories, right? There was sabotage going on and intentional destruction of property by Germany within the United States. British search and seize contraband. Well, basically both the British and Germans, had this search and seize, but in the beginning, there was freedom of the seas, and it was very important for Americans to be able to be neutral and free with their ships on the seas, and especially merchants, right? And as a neutral nation, the United States maintained the right to trade with both the Allies and the Central Powers. But American commerce was caught right in the middle, between the warring European powers, of course. Great Britain proclaimed the North Sea to be a military zone, so if neutral ships, especially from America, were headed for Germany, they had to stop and be searched for contraband of war. And so the American ships were not only being searched by British ships, but they would again now be searched by German ships too. But British would seize any cargoes that were being resold to Germany. So that kind of slowed down our, bringing contraband, especially into Germany. But what happened then, as we looked on with the German U-boats were the submarines. This was more serious threat than any the British did towards American ships. So the German Navy, they called it Untersee boot, or U-boat. That means undersea boat, as a weapon of war. So, and these were new to to Americans especially, and to the Allies. These were ships that could go undersea. So, under international law, the warships which seized or sank a merchant vessel were required to provide for the safety of passengers and crew. Needless to say, submarine was a different vehicle. So basically, it was not followed. The rules were not followed by German submarines at all. If a submarine surfaced, it was vulnerable then. So it would stay underneath the sea. So they didn't follow anything about, requiring safety of passengers, of crew, of their enemy, right? So in February of 1915, Germany declared the area around the British Isles there as a war zone. And it announced that merchant ships found in this zone would be sunk without warning. Neutral ships entering the zone would do so at their own risk. So they're basically saying, okay, you guys come into the war zone, we may just sink you, right? Without warning. And so submarines became a great fear in the area of, especially around Great Britain. And we were actually bringing in a lot of our merchant ships into Great Britain. Here's some pictures of the German submarines. The Lusitania. Okay, what happened to the Lusitania? Well, Germany carried out a threat and began sinking ships in the war zone. On May 7th, 1915, Americans still were neutral, remember? Americans were shocked by this large British luxury liner, not a warship, that had been sunk off the coast of Ireland. You can imagine, right off Ireland, an English-British luxury liner. They sunk this. Over 1,000 people lost their lives, and on the Lusitania, there were 100 Americans that died when the ship was sunk. 100 Americans. So now Americans are thinking, wow, they're sinking our luxury ships. What else are they going to do, right? But Germany insisted justified because the Lusitania may have been carrying munitions, they said. They weren't sure, they were just going to sink it. So the sinking of the Lusitania angered the American people more than any other incident. They were angered that the Germany could care less if there were Americans on board. So Americans began to call for a declaration of war against Germany, but of course, President Wilson was not yet ready to declare war and trying to get through this in a peaceful way without America being drawn into a war. So President started taking action. President Wilson sent 3 progressively stronger letters to the German government insisting that the sinking of passenger ships without warning should be stopped or must be stopped. Secretary William Jennings Bryan, very much of a pacifist secretary and wanting to keep the United States in the state of peace, chose actually to resign from Wilson's cabinet rather than sign a second note, thinking it might lead America into war. So he was saying, with Wilson, if you send any more notes, which Wilson sent 3 of them, that we might be drawn into war. So he, getting upset, withdrew from Secretary of State. September 15th, finally, the German ambassador promised and said, liners, those luxury liners will not be sunk by our submarines without warning and without the safety of lives of non-combatants, provided that the liners do not try to escape or offer resistance. So Germany, after 3 letters, did answer and say, we're not going to sink them, but as long as you don't offer resistance. So, would they keep their pledge? We'll find out. The Sussex Pledge, May of 1916. First on March of 1916, trouble flared when the French steamer, I'm not talking about English now, the French steamer Sussex was sunk without warning. Many lives were lost and Americans on board were injured. So now they're sinking French liners, right? A French steamer called the Sussex. So it's not just a Lusitania. Now we have the same problem going on with the French ships that are being sunk by the Germans. So President Wilson warned, unless this policy of sinking ships without warning were stopped, the United States would break off diplomatic relations altogether. And this was a threatened prelude to war. Basically, he was saying, okay, we're going to break off diplomatic relations, that we may be coming into war. So on that's 2 months later, of 1916, Germany again pledged not to sink merchant vessels, giving the Sussex Pledge. Remember, Sussex is another name for a French vessel, Sussex. Well, it was the name of the French vessel. So they called it the Sussex Pledge. And so the Germany pledged, said, I'll give you the Sussex Pledge. We'll now pledge not to sink any more merchant vessels. We just sunk this French one, but we're not going to do this. However, Germany made this Sussex Pledge with a stipulation that the United States must persuade Great Britain to not blockade German ports. So now what Germany was doing was putting United States as a pawn there, saying, well, we won't sink your ships, but you're going to have to talk to Britain and tell them not to blockade our ports. Well, we're supposed to be neutral, right? So President Wilson pointed out that the United States could not be held responsible for the actions of other nations. That the United States was not going to go in there and talk to Britain about not blockading their ports because we were not at war. So the German submarines made no more attacks on merchant vessels for the rest of the year, but, did not totally adhere to their pledge, right? So here's a picture of the Sussex Pledge. Remember, Sussex is a French vessel. After sinking the French ship Sussex, Germans promised not to sink any more merchant ships without warning, hoping to keep the Americans out of the war. But would they do that? And here's a picture here of Wilson signing American ship sunk without warning. He's signing this, trying to figure out how we could still stay out of war in the midst of our ships being sunk by German submarines. Then came the election of 1916 in the midst of this, and Wilson his pledge was to keep America out of war. Again, vote for Wilson, who kept you out of war. We're going to keep you out of war. He's throwing the baseball in saying, yes, we are at peace. We're going to keep America out of war. So in 1916 election, Wilson did defeat Charles Evan Hughes. He was of the Supreme Court in 1916 in a very close race. So here we have a picture of Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evan Hughes, but it was very close. Wilson almost lost at the midst, saying he wanted to keep us out of war. A lot of Americans were ready for war. So the election, Wilson won, but not by very much. Not by a large margin, that is sure. American preparedness for war. So President Wilson by 1915 had begun to urge a preparedness for war, though. So just in case we have to go to war. So in June of 1916, this is the year, 1916, the end of the year, will be the election, right? Congress passed the National Defense Act. And this act provided for an increase in the size of our Army and to organize what's called a National Guard to be called into action if wartime. So it basically said, okay, we need to increase the size, we need to have recruits, call to duty, join the Army at this time, getting ready for possible war, right? And then setting forth a National Guard, and the Guard would be just ready to go to war if needed, right? And so this authorized also $500 million for the building of battleships, destroyers, and United States started building some submarines. Remember, we're not used to fighting a war with submarines. And so the Council of National Defense set up to unify American industries and resources. Basically saying we set up a Council of National Defense so that we can put our industries together so that we can build these battleships and destroyers and submarines and get ready for possible war. Wilson, though, was still seeking peace, but on January 1917, President Wilson, in a speech before Senate, called for peace without victory. What is peace without victory? Well, that was his call. It was a peace that would be forced upon the loser and would lead, basically a peace forced upon the loser would lead to another war. So he was saying a war must end with a peace between equals. Well, this is kind of, idealistic, really, to say we could actually say peace without victory. So he tried to put this together, how we can bring in peace without going to war. So the right of every nationality of people to determine their own government. So Wilson was putting to forth what he thought as a League of Nations even then. And we're going to talk about the League of Nations after the war. But he was putting together how we can keep people at peace, in some way and uniting them and having every nationality determine their own government. Let the governments, the nations have their own governments and putting these governments together and helping them. He was trying to put this together. This advocated the limitation of armaments and a guarantee of freedom of the seas. So how could America tell Europe to limit their armaments, to limit basically limit their submarines and limit their machine guns and limit all of their armaments, right? He said limitations of armaments and a guarantee of freedom of the seas, and to guarantee that the seas would be free no matter what. Do you think the European, especially Germany, would really follow this? They might say they would, but you look at mankind and the sin of mankind. Even today, when we have limitation of armaments to different countries, do they really limit their armaments? Further suggestion was that an international organization be created to maintain world peace. So this is Woodrow Wilson's big thing, is that he wanted to have a global organization. I'll just call it a peace organization, that all the countries get together and be able to talk peace, right? But the major powers of Europe were uninterested in Wilson's plea for peace. So Wilson is thinking about how we can go into Europe and into the world and seek peace. We need to have an organization, a peace organization. And he was looking, that's a good thing, but could it really happen? So here we have Wilson say, only a peace between equals can last. Only a peace, the very principle of which is equality and a common participation in a common benefit. Words, but would they be able to do this? Or would this be a reality or just an ideal? Unrestricted submarine warfare. Okay, let's go back to the submarine warfare. The German government, after Wilson's speech, announced it was now adopting a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Basically now, after his speech, they said, oh, you're talking of peace and you want us to limit? Well, right now, guess what we're going to do? We're going to sink any ship that comes in to the war zone. We don't care if it's American. Unrestricted submarine warfare. So we're not making any more deals, they said. Germany said, we're not going to make any more deals about who we sink. And if you're there, we may just sink you. So on February 1st, 1917, the German submarines would sink all ships that were in the war zone without warning. All of ships that were neutral or not, they would sink them. The United States would be allowed only one ship per week to and from United Kingdom. And of course, that ship would have to be come through the point and actually be searched for contraband. Only if the ship was clearly marked, the United States had to clearly mark that it was a United States ship on a prescribed route and carried no contraband. So they said, United States, you can come one ship per week, but we need to go and check you out to make sure you have no contraband. And also you'd have to be clearly marked, because if you're not marked and we don't know who you are, we will be able to sink you, or you have to be right on the route that we tell you to go. They made big rules for the United States. This would break the Sussex Pledge. Remember the pledge they made not to sink anymore? Well, now they would just break it. They made a pledge and now they said, we're breaking it. Germany did not care if the United States declared war in that sense. So after Wilson's talking about world peace, Germany goes just the opposite way. So Germany believed that they could cut off British supplies and defeat the Allies before the United States had time to mobilize. So what Germany basically was saying is that, okay, we could, now that they said that, they figured the United States would probably try to get ready for war. but they believed that they could now cut off British supplies and defeat the Allies really quick before the United States got into the war. They thought, oh, we're going to be able to we're going to be able to conquer them before the United States even blinks. The United States then breaks diplomatic relations with Germany. On February 3rd, 1917, the United States breaks these relations, basically saying, no, we are not going to be allies with you anymore. We're not neutral. It dismisses the German ambassador from the United States and says, we're not going to have this German ambassador. Lets the ambassador go home. Then on March 1917, President Wilson orders American merchantmen to arm up for self-defense, telling our merchants that are on the seas in their ships that you better arm up for self-defense because Germany is going to want to sink your ships. So this is the first step to calling out war on the Central Powers and Germany, specifically Germany. In spite of all this crazy thing happened with the Zimmerman note. It infuriated the American people. So what was this Zimmerman telegram? Well, the British agents intercepted and decoded a secret message. So these agents, they're looking at the codes of Germany, and they saw there was a message going from Germany to Mexico. And so the German Foreign Secretary was Arthur Zimmermann from Germany, had sent it to the German minister in Mexico. So this message is going in. It's not even to America. It's going into Mexico. And the note proposed that Mexico and Germany form an alliance if the United States entered the war. So Germany is saying, okay, Mexico, I see you're having some problems, Pancha Villa, and these things are going on, and, going on, and Wilson not really, not accepting everything that's going on in the midst of all this and accepting your government as it is. Sorry, I have this mosquito coming after me. But anyway, in return for helping Germany defeat the United States, Mexico was to regain her lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And the British officials intercepted and forwarded the message directly to the United States. So on March 1st, 1917, the message was printed where? In the American newspapers. This infuriated the American people. Do you see how this went? Basically, this telegram that went to Mexico was saying from Germany, the Germans were saying, hey, Mexico, I know you're having problems with the United States, but if you decide to join us, join the Central Powers and fight this war against America, against the United States, then when we win, Germany is thinking, well, we'll win against America, and we'll give you Texas and New Mexico and Arizona as an award. We'll give them back to you, saying this. But this being intercepted was then published in the newspapers of America, and the American people were now realizing, man, Germany wants to turn Mexico against us and cause a war right here in our land, right? The Zimmerman note. So in spite of all of the circumstances, President Wilson insisted on withholding a declaration of war until Germany committed overt acts against us. So even despite the Zimmerman note, President Wilson saying, but Germany has not really committed overt acts yet. So, but mid-March 1917, the German submarines started sinking more American merchant ships. 4 more. So the submarines were coming, and despite all of this, they started just randomly sinking our ships. And there was a loss of at least 15 lives in the midst of this. Plus, sinking our ships, we're losing a lot of our supplies. So President Wilson called for a special session of Congress. So on April 2nd, 1917, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. So on April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany, joining the Allied cause. However, the United States entered the war as an associate power in an attempt to keep out the entangling alliances. So basically, Wilson says we're entering the war, but we're going to be associate power. We're not going to be the main power there. We're going to be associate power, basically associate power in helping out Great Britain and France, right? This would give greater negotiating powers. So that's what he thought, that now, maybe he could eventually put forth a peace conference in some way. So even though he's declaring war, he's saying we're going to be associate power. So, hey, that's about it. But the thing is, now we know what all of these things that would push America into war in World War I. Would you have wanted to go into war at this time? I think with all that ever happening, that's all that we could do. So anyway, we're going to go on about what happened during the war with America entering the war.